For the past 2.5 years, I've been covering arts and culture goings on in and around Davis. And these events and programs enrich our lives as patrons of the arts, of course. But another important part of this landscape is the role it plays in preparing some of our own residents for professional artistic careers beyond the boundaries of our fair city. Davis native Malcolm MacKenzie has had a 30-year career as a professional opera singer. Our native baritone has been heard at leading opera houses throughout the United States and Europe, including the Metropolitan Opera, New York City Opera, Paris Opera Bastille, Finland's Savonlinna Festival, Washington National Opera, Los Angeles Opera, and many others. Upcoming in the 24-25 season, Malcolm will return to the Met to sing the role of Stubb in their production of Moby Dick. And he sings Sharpless in Madame Butterfly with both Austin Opera and Opera San Antonio. Malcolm is also a veteran of the concert stage. He has performed frequently as the baritone soloist for Carl Orff's Carmina Burana, including a 2006 performance with the UC Davis Symphony Orchestra. That, by the way, has received 17 million views on YouTube. He has also appeared with the Los Angeles Master Chorale, the Pacific Chorale, the Los Angeles Mozart Orchestra, and the Madison Symphony. Welcome, Malcolm.
Good morning.
Thanks for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
So, so what inspired your love for opera, and what gave you the courage to take a chance on a career in this field?
Hmm. Courage. Wow. I don't think of it that way, but I don't know. I was super lucky. I grew up in a household and a family that were always interested in music. My uncle Malcolm, who was a UC Davis professor and also a rather well-known hematologist, was a singer in DCOC, the Davis Comic Opera Society. So when I was quite young, I saw many Gilbert and Sullivan productions at the Veterans Memorial Theater with my uncle in roles. So to me, it was kind of a normal thing for a member of our family to be singing on a stage. So it's something that I was interested in. I think probably from a young age. Although I didn't consider it as a career until I was in college. Actually, I was a I went to college with the idea of going into the medical field actually, but I ended up getting diverted and became a singer.
So, you mentioned the Davis Comic Opera Company. Were there other resources in Davis growing up, and your uncle, who I had the pleasure of knowing, as a matter of
Yeah.
fact? Um, Were there other resources in the community or in the schools that you think were formative in launching you onto this career?
Well, it's only in later years that I realized how unusual and different the Davis school system was at the time, at least. In that there were music programs from very early on. I was a band kid, and back then there were bands for each of the uh, grade schools and also each of the junior high schools all had their own band and their own choirs too. And I was part of that as well. So yes, absolutely. There were performing opportunities that from the time I was 10 or 11. I think, and I've now realized that in the grand scheme of school systems throughout the country that ours was very unusual. And the idea that we at the time had five choirs and a jazz choir and a madrigal choir and all these things in our high school was very unusual. But at the time, it was just what we had. So I thought I was just extremely lucky. I think.
So, with all the success you've had, and we've mentioned a few of those things up front, uh, you could have chosen to live anywhere in the United States, and you do obviously move around. You're not a resident of a particular company. Why Davis? Why did you and your wife choose to come back to Davis and raise a family here and use this as your home base for this distinguished career?
Yeah. well, I have the great luck of being, as you say, being able to live wherever I want because of I usually work remotely. I work at various companies, whoever contracts me individually. So it doesn't matter in particular where I'm staying. So we were able to choose where we want to live based on the kind of life that we wanted our children to have. We lived in Los Angeles for years. But my wife and I are both from Davis, and we both have happy memories of living and growing up in Davis. And at the time when we were thinking about having children, our my wife's parents still lived in Davis, um, so we basically moved home to be near the grandparents and to give our kids a chance to grow up the same way that we grew up. Subsequently, my parents, who had since moved away from Davis, moved back to Davis, I think, to be grandparents. So we ended up having a lot of family support um, in the area when I was gone. So when I would be away, my wife Heather would have support from family members with raising our children, and hey, Davis is a very nice place to live. So
Well, and that's an experience I can certainly identify with because my wife and I also moved back to Davis or to Davis where my
mhm,
wife grew up, and had the help of my in-laws raising our two sons. And I should add, we also had the help of your two daughters because your two
indeed.
daughters were also babysitters for our two sons. So that's a happy
Mm.
memory as well. Okay, let's go back to the opera stage. Maybe a standard question, but got to ask you: do you have a favorite opera? Do you have a favorite role?
You're right. It is a standard question. I get that question a lot, and it's a very difficult choice to make because I like different roles at different times and for different reasons, of course. And as I've moved along in my career, the roles that I sing have changed. But I guess I'd have to say it's good to be bad, and probably the role of Scarpia in Tosca. He's the baddie in Puccini's Tosca. Is probably one of my absolute favorites to play. Um, Other favorites are probably well. I had the great luck of being able to sing the title role in Simone Boccanegra, which is a Giuseppe Verdi opera. I've only done that once. It's rarely performed, and that was a career highlight for me. And if I could do that role again, I would absolutely do that again. But it's probably not going to happen. But I think overall, yeah, probably Scarpia and Tosca. I play a lot of bad guys due to the nature of sound of my voice, the kind of voice that I have. So I enjoy the bad guys.
So, how do you keep a role fresh? And to kind of add to that too, have you played the same role in different productions, and have you done that differently?
Yes, that yes, I've done a lot of repeats of the same role. I've sung Sharpless and Butterfly many times. For example, and I'll use that as an example because I have two coming up next year. Uh, it's never really hard to keep a role fresh. I don't, at least I don't find. Because the entire circumstances surrounding the production are different. I have different colleagues. I have a different director. The production itself, how it looks, the costumes, the sets, the stage. I'm different because I'm a different age, and human voices are changing all the time. So I never feel like I'm singing the same role with the same voice. It's always a little different. Each time I have to do a role, um, I have to recoach it, have more lessons, decide how I'm going to do it this time because your voice changes as you age, especially. So I don't really have a problem with feeling that a role gets stale or anything like that. I suppose if I were a Broadway person and I sang the same role 8 times a week for 2 years, that would be a totally different situation. But opera's not like that. We rarely do more than a handful of performances. Sometimes as many as 10. But usually it's just a few. So there's no time for it to get old hat, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah. And is that more limited run a function of just the energy that's needed to put it on? Is it a function of demand from audiences?
Oh, no, it's totally about how expensive opera is to put on.
Ah, okay.
Um,
Mhm,
Opera is never and never has been. I don't want to make it sound like this is a new thing, but opera never has been a money making art form. The only reason why opera happens is the generosity of donors who love opera. No company survives by ticket sales. It just doesn't happen. I think the average for most companies is around 30% of their budget comes from ticket sales. So
mhm,
they have to make up 60% through donations or through other marketing campaigns. So usually the number of performances is constrained not by how many they can sell, but by how many they can afford to put on. So most smaller companies, for example, will do 2 to maybe 4 performances of a particular
mhm,
opera. And then you have
hmm,
places like the Met, which are a totally different budget level, where they'll do maybe 8 or 10. And maybe they'll do it again later in the season. So in the fall, they'll have 8 Carmens, and in the spring, they'll have another 5 or something like that. But that's a real unusual situation. Those larger
mhm,
houses.
hmm. Let me ask you something else about the distinctive nature of opera, because it has the vocal, but it has acting as well. And of course, it's not a musical, as you referred to musicals a moment ago. How important is the acting in opera?
That's an interesting question. Nowadays, it's paramount. It's very important because audiences are used to singing actors. They're used to what they see on TV and in movies and in Broadway shows where the acting is integral to the performance. In the past, opera was much more about the singing and the acting was much more representational. But nowadays, the directors that we have in opera are usually directors who work across multiple mediums. So we have as true to life acting as you can manage, stage acting as you can manage, meaning that it's going to be a little larger than life because it has to be on stage. And it does have to accommodate for the vocalism because when one is singing in an opera, you have to make enough sound that your voice is heard over a large orchestra, and we are not amplified. So there are physical requirements just to make the sounds that we're making, um, which sometimes require changing up how the acting is being done. Maybe just as far as like which way you're pointing, which way you're pointing your body. So,
Mhm.
uh, but these days the acting requirements are similar to what you would see in any Broadway show or any play. I would say any straight play, just because that's what the audiences are expecting, and that's what they
Right.
want.
Well, that was great. I have to say I learned a lot from that response. I really didn't know what to expect when I asked you that question. So I really appreciate that. Um, so speaking of the demands, the financial demands on opera, and the changing nature, and other artistic resources out there that are pulling demands on audiences and whatnot. Are you confident about the future of opera?
Oh, that's a loaded question. Um, has been shrinking in the last. It's really 40 years or so. It kind of reached a peak in the 70s and 80s, I think, of the previous century, and it's been shrinking in its scope. I think as far as how many companies and what their relative budgets are. I mean, the way I see it, it's like you used to see opera singers on talk shows in the evenings, in the 70s, 80s, and maybe even the early 90s, and you just don't anymore. It's not the kind of art form, the popular kind of art form that it used to be.
Now you have to tune
Uh,
into in the studio on Davis Media Access to hear an interview with an opera singer. rather than turning it down.
Yes, well said. Very, very good. Yes. Yeah. So I do think it's an art form that is it's constantly in trouble of shrinking and disappearing, and it has shrunk overall. But we're still here. There were dire predictions back in the economic downturn in the early 2000s that opera would disappear, and but it has not. And we're still here. So I think there's always going to be, as long as we invest in youth and education for music, there's going to be a market for opera. It's a singular experience hearing someone portray a character vocally unamplified in an unamplified space with an acoustical orchestra playing along. And I think um, people don't realize that they might like it until they go and they see it. So the more things we do with schools and exposing people to this art form at a younger age, the better we'll do. But it's still, people come away from their first opera going, "Wow, that's not what I thought it was going to be. That was really interesting. That was really exciting. It was
Mhm.
it was moving." And I hope that in the future. It continues to be that kind of source of inspiration that way. I teach singing, I teach vocalism specifically because I think it's worth trying to keep this skill set. Uh, as with any other skill set in classical music, I think it's worth keeping that knowledge alive and passing it on and keeping it
Yeah.
keeping it going.
Well, to that point about the schools in particular, in addition to the work you do in teaching students yourself, what's your sense of schools generally, or the Davis schools in particular? You raised a couple of children who went through the schools here. Do you think we're still doing enough here in Davis uh, for
No, I'm
this?
actually troubled. I'm troubled with with the way things have gone, especially recently. Recently, how the music departments within what the contrast is when I started at when I went to Emerson Junior High, because I went to Emerson Junior High. There was there were two different choirs. There was a beginning choir and an advanced choir, and there was a full scale band that was its own band, and there were two different teachers uh, for those courses. And now the teachers did hop around from, at least I believe the choir teacher did hop from one school to the other. I don't remember now if the band teacher did, but I think so. And we were putting on musicals every year in seventh and eighth and ninth grade. There was a musical that was put on. We had three performances of a musical every year, and it's just not like that now. I know that the music departments have shrunk way down. They no longer have the teachers there to teach it, and the budget for all that has gone way down. And this is something that requires everyone's attention. I mean, if we lose that continuity, that thread of musical education throughout the school. I mean, you can say that, well, they have that in the high school, but if they're not prepared when they're younger, by the time they get to high school, the level that they'll achieve musically when they're in high school is greatly reduced. And there was a time when Davis schools won all the awards, for musical performances and during competitions, and their bands and their choirs traveled all over the place. Um, and while there's still some of that now, the level is still not the same as it used to be. And I mourn that a little bit because part of the only reason why I am a career musician, a career singer, is because of the great education that I got at a young age. So when I decided that I wanted to be a singer when I was in college, I could already read music. I already had sung in choirs for years. It wasn't just something that I had done, last week. I had years of experience and years of performance experience. When I was in the madrigals, we did 50 concerts a year. Um, Um, so I'm concerned. I'm concerned. I
Okay.
hope that this is a short-term dip in the attention to music in the schools, and that things will improve. But um, I'm concerned.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that. Now, before we go, I just have to comment on the fact that, according to your Facebook page, you are also a bit of a Star Wars fan. In fact,
Just a
your
bit, yeah,
profile
just a bit.
picture is a stormtrooper, and then there was a character next to that I didn't recognize, but it looked like kind of an R2D2 version of a stormtrooper, or a stormtrooper version of an
Yes,
R2D2.
yes.
But anyway, my question is there a connection between Star Wars and opera? Is there something operatic about that? Is that, or is it just completely separate interest of yours?
You I don't know. I'm chuckling because I don't think I've had anybody make that connection ever before. Because you're right. When Star Wars first was the first movie came out in 1977, it was described as being a saga or a space opera. And it's funny, I never really thought about that, but yes, I guess there is there. It's about iconography, right? It's about how uh, stories are told in archetypal formats, and Star Wars is definitely it's a fantasy story. It's not a really a science fiction story. So yes, in that way, I guess there is an operatic connection. In a more even particularly basic level, I was enthralled by the voice of James Earl Jones as Darth Vader, because I just thought that was such an amazing thing that the human voice could carry that type of character, and I'm sure that has something to do with me using my voice as my my living, but yes, that character next to that stormtrooper is a robot that I built myself, which is a hobby for me to build full size animatronic robots, which we then use for benefit purposes, where going and visiting children in hospitals and stuff, and which is just a hobby that I very much enjoy, which is my life away from being a stage performer. It allows me to perform, but not really perform, because I'm hiding in the background with my controller for the robot, and everybody thinks the robot's doing it all itself. So it's kind of performing, but it's not really performing. So
Uh, well, thank you for sharing that with us. And you heard it here first on In the Studio, Davis Media Access, the connection, Malcolm MacKenzie making the connection for the first time publicly between opera and Star Wars. So,
yeah, I never thought of that, but that's probably true. Yes.
well, look, I have had the absolute pleasure of speaking here with Malcolm MacKenzie, a professional opera singer who hails from Davis and continues to call it home. For more information on Malcolm and his upcoming season, you can go to malcolmmackenzie.org. I believe that's showing on the screen now. And there you will also find links to his Facebook and YouTube pages. Thank you so much, Malcolm.
It's my pleasure.
I'm Tim Gaffaney, and you've been watching In the Studio on Davis Media Access.